Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, former NFL Scout and currently of Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by Aaron Schatz, the godfather of football analytics and the founder of Football Outsiders. And today we have a very special guest. It's Scott Spratt. Scott, as you may know, won an award at Sloan, the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, for his baseball research on strike zone runs saved. And he was one of the founding members of the football department here at SIS, including as the original host of the Off the Charts Football Podcast. After spending some time doing his own thing, including being a finalist for the 2018 Fantasy Sports Writers Association Football Writer of the Year Award, Scott has reunited with Aaron at Football Outsiders, and we are excited to have him back in the mix, hopefully as a regular guest during the 2019 season. Welcome back, Scott.
Thanks, Matt. I'm happy to be back, and I'm happy to be an analyst and let you do all the hard work for the show today.
That's right. No more producing.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I just have to wait for Matt to set me up and make me sound good. That's really the goal.
Well, today I'm doing the production work. Usually you'll see we have Justin here with us. He's on vacation today, but I think we can all agree it's nice having a producer around.
Absolutely.
All right, well, let's get right into things. Big news coming out this morning. We got to talk about it. Melvin Gordon holding out. Aaron, you first. What do you make of this?
Well, it's going to be an interesting test for running backs at how much teams are willing to pay them. Because on one hand, if you were going to pay a running back, Melvin Gordon would be one to pay. I mean, he's been outstanding, and he's been outstanding in ways that are not dependent on his offensive line. He's usually near the top of the league in broken tackles. He does a lot of receiving. He gets a lot of receptions, and he gets a good amount of yards per catch with his receptions. On the other hand, all of the research that we've done about running back replaceability and the fact that he literally has a backup who has performed as well as he has in Austin Eckler, and they've got a third string back that they really like, which is Justin Jackson. So, I mean, if on one hand, this is a guy you would pay if you would pay anyone. On the other hand, would you pay anyone?
Yeah, I'm with you there. He's, if not a blue chip running back, certainly at least a red chip, a second tier player, definitely in the top 10 in his position, probably in the top 5 in his position in the league. But yeah, it's a question of running back value. And it becomes a really, really tricky thing, especially when humans become involved. Scott, what was your perspective on this one?
I'm actually agreeing with Aaron. And for anyone that's listening and wondering why we think he's so good, even though before last year he had some pretty bad yards per carry average numbers. He actually has often led the league in third and short carries or carries near the goal line. These are very difficult carries to take and often lead to low carry yardages. So he's always been a very efficient player on a difficult set of carries. And then last year it kind of all came together too. But I think he's performed much better when you're looking at the advanced numbers than he has by traditional yard per carry average numbers.
Right, and that's why you see he's strong in terms of stats like success rate, positive play percentage. He'll do a little bit better there, and that goes back to what you were saying about the situation. That's kind of interesting. I haven't seen any sort of stats that kind of look into the yardage expectation that you would have on a play and look at rushing performance as like an above or below expectation. That's kind of what you're alluding to there.
Or what
right?
DVOA does, because by
DVOA
versus average. Right, when I created DVOA, when I was first doing it, it was just success points per play, right? And then this was 15 years ago. Mike Allstott came out as the best running back in the league, and I said that doesn't make any sense. And the reason why was because he got his carries in situations where you could get a lot of success if you were successful, like 3rd and 1s and goal line carries. But you also don't get a lot of 6-yard carries from the 1-yard line. It's sort of hard to do. So you have to adjust for that when you look at what players are doing, and that's one of the things that DVOA does. And Gordon had below average DVOA the last couple of years until 2018, and then he was phenomenal last year. And I think a lot of that has to do with the blocking that he's getting, because he had tons of broken tackles before last year. He just, a lot of running backs' performance is dependent on blocking, but then that's a reason to not pay running backs, is that a lot of running back performance is dependent on blocking. And it's not that some running backs aren't better than other running backs. It's that the difference between the good ones and an average one and what that gives your team is just nowhere near as high as the difference between a good cornerback versus an average cornerback, or a good pass rusher versus an average pass rusher. When you're deciding who to pay, you have to pay based on the positions that are going to give you the most impact by having an above average player. It's not that there is no such thing as an above average running back. It's that, first of all, it's harder to tell who the above average running backs are because of the importance of the offensive line. And second, that the running back, even the ones that are above average, they don't improve your team as much as players at other positions.
And then, so the obvious example going back just a year ago, looking at the Le'Veon Bell, the James Conner drop off, that wasn't so much of a drop off. I think this could be a similar situation, assuming Eckler can stay healthy, that would be, you're going from a top running back in the league to a very good running back. And at the end of the day, it's probably not that big a difference in terms of actually winning and losing football games. I wanted to go back because you mentioned Mike Alstott, and when you were originally doing your calculations years ago, the numbers were kind of telling you he was the best running back in the league. I think it's interesting because now we know that, for all the times where we say teams should be passing more, there are certain situations where we think running's a really good idea, like on 3rd and 1. And so it's kind of interesting that Mike Alstott, who is primarily only used as a ball carrier in the situations that we would consider the efficient situations to run the ball, he appeared to be somebody who was a very good running back. It's just kind of interesting as we start to tease out the usage from the actual player and what they're accomplishing on the field. Those sorts of things, it makes sense to me, honestly, looking back in that sense.
I mean, even a guy who was below average on 3rd and 1, if you get a lot of 3rd and 1 carries and a lot of goal line carries, you'll come out as providing more. You'll have, for example, more expected points added for your team than guys who mostly get the ball in 1st and 10, because 3rd and 1 is where the real expected points added come in for running plays, and goal line is really where that helps. But it doesn't mean you are necessarily an above average back. You could be a below average back in that situation, but just because you're mostly used in situations with value, you have value.
Agree there. Anything else before we move on to the next topic? All right, let's move forward and talk about Scott wrote 2 columns for Football Outsiders already. He writes well and he writes quickly, and he wrote one on quarterbacks with and without pressure and then one on defenses with and without pressure. Aaron, we kind of talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, but Scott writing these specific columns, I wanted to ask you, what were your biggest takeaways from this research?
There were a couple of interesting findings from the work that I've done so far, which has all been sort of pressure related. One of them was that pressure rate predicts future pressure rate better than the DVOA pressure splits predict themselves in future seasons. And that's really compelling because pressure rate is actually a really good predictor of DVOA with pressure, just about as good as DVOA with pressure is itself. So that means if you can find a team that does really well in generating pressure, even if their DVOA with pressure isn't great, you can expect that to bounce back in future seasons. And to me, the team that stands out in this respect from last year was the LA Rams, a team that was number 1 in pressure rate, but was only kind of middle of the pack with their DVOA with pressure. So that's, I think, a way that you can expect the Rams to really improve next year. Not that they needed that much help, considering they were in the Super Bowl anyway last year.
Yeah, well, if their offense takes a step back, they'll need some help from the defense.
That's a good point. If Bill Belichick kind of figured out how to attack them and other teams can follow suit, maybe you're right there.
Or maybe they regress just because they were so out of this world good last year. Like I think we all expect the Chiefs to regress a bit this year. I think it's fascinating the way that you kind of have split this out, especially looking at the correlations with DVOA versus with pressure and with pressure over itself, because what we can kind of start to do is like we're very used to looking at, say, quarterback stats with pressure, without pressure, and kind of understanding what those means. But what you can almost do is start to combine those to really understand the player more. So we don't have to make a decision to only care about how the quarterback performs without pressure. Because, one of the things that you found, for example, that for a quarterback, the amount that they're pressured correlates with their DVOA under pressure. So guys that seem to lead themselves into situations that cause more pressure, because we know the quarterback has something to do with that, those guys have more control over their performance under pressure. in those situations. So what you can kind of do is you can start to split that out, and you can sort of create, okay, we can expect 70% of the time that this quarterback is not going to be under pressure, because that's how often they're under pressure historically, and that's mostly under their control. We can predict what they're going to be as a quarterback based on how they performed without pressure historically, and we can sort of predict how they're going to be with pressure, especially if they're a guy that gets pressured more of the time. It's kind of an interesting way to flip it on its head. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, I wonder how much it has to do with scrambles. One of the things that might be interesting in the future is for us to go and look at the rating under pressure for just passes compared to rating under pressure for passes and scrambles. I wonder if one of the reasons why guys with higher pressure rates tend to be better under pressure is because they scramble well. And, scrambling tend to be high efficiency plays because, usually you get a few yards.
And those guys are usually your Deshaun Watsons of the world, people like that, looking in on Scott's article there. Scott, what were your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it's kind of hilarious because this was the first thing I wrote for Football Outsiders, and my instincts were just so horribly wrong with this in the first place. I was actually looking this up related to Josh Rosen, thinking that, here's a guy that just faced a ton of pressure for the Cardinals last year and performed really poorly. Was the game getting sped up for him or something like that? And what I think these results are suggesting are more what you and Aaron are saying here, that it goes the other way, and that the abilities of the quarterback almost drive the pressure rate as much or more than their own blocking. And like what you were saying there is definitely true with Deshaun Watson and Russell Wilson, those guys frequently having high pressure rates, because I think they're taking more time looking for big plays and then scrambling out of that sort of danger. But then you also have guys on the other end of things, like Peyton Manning has the 3 seasons with the lowest pressure rate of any player over the last decade. And Manning was just really effective in getting rid of the ball quickly to avoid pressure even happening. And I almost feel like that's the better skill for a quarterback than performing well under pressure, is just avoiding pressure in the first place by making a quick decision and a quick throw.
Because ratings are so much better without pressure than they are under pressure for everybody. I will say that quarterback does have an impact on the pressure rate, but it's not entire. I think there's been some feeling like it's entirely on the quarterback. Like maybe it's not on the offensive line at all. It's clearly a combination of the two. And a good example of that is Andrew Luck, because Andrew Luck had a very high pressure rate, and then all of a sudden this year he had a very low pressure rate.
Right. There's no doubt about that. It's on the offensive line. It's on the quarterback to an extent. It's on the system. As we started, last year was the first year that we started gathering drop types at SIS. So was it a 3-step drop? Was it a 7-step drop? And really getting granular on that level. I'm hoping that as we start to look into this more in the future, we can start to see that, clearly a 3-step drop is less likely to be a pressure than a 7-step drop. And we already kind of know that. So we should be able to build that into when we think about pressure rate, what we're actually saying. Because a lot of times we might just be saying they call a lot of bubble screens because those aren't going to be pressures.
Right. The other argument is that you could say that for a player who plays well under pressure, if it's true that these guys with higher pressure rates play better under pressure over the long term, maybe it kind of makes sense for teams like Houston and Seattle to cheapen out on their offensive line a little bit, because they know that their quarterbacks play better under pressure, and maybe their money is better spent on defense or on receivers or something.
I think that's definitely true, Aaron. The real hope then is just that Deshaun Watson can stay as healthy as Russell Wilson has been able to stay. Wilson's really good at avoiding those hits. And Watson, even though he's been hurt a lot in his career, it's kind of been the non-contact ACL type of injuries. To me, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be, getting hit a lot while he's scrambling. I think he can still be pretty healthy the rest of his career if that plays out well.
So I don't know, though. For me, going back to Scott's point that, you'd rather have a quarterback that's really good at avoiding pressure to begin with and then performing well when not having pressure, Peyton Manning, than kind of these other guys. I think part of that is because it's really hard to make the decision to not prioritize the offensive line, especially when you have a Deshaun Watson that you're worried about the frailty back there. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword, his mobility there, because in one sense, okay, you don't have to plan around it. He can avoid the pressure. He has shown that he's a better quarterback under pressure than most, and he can tolerate kind of a high pressure rate until his knee snaps. And it's a hard thing to do. So my instincts as a football guy really want to push back on that thought of trying to invest on the receivers and running backs ahead of the offensive line. And I wonder if maybe even if you are kind of one of these quarterbacks that likes to hold on to the ball longer, man, if Aaron Rodgers can hold on to the ball for a long time without getting pressured, I'd really like to see what he can do. Just because those guys can tolerate pressure, I'd like to see them hold the ball without having to deal with that pressure.
Right, and of course, offensive line means more than just pressure rate, right? I mean, we were talking about the running game before with Melvin Gordon, and that your running game depends a lot more on your offensive line than your running back, it seems. So it's not that you necessarily – maybe it's less that you'd want to cheap on the offensive line and more that run blocking may be as important as pass blocking, not less important.
Interesting thoughts. All right, let's take a quick break. Love that conversation. We'll talk about the SIS Data Hub, and then we'll be right back in to talk more about Scott, Football Outsiders, and Sports Info Solutions, and the history of the Off the Charts podcast. The Off the Charts Football Podcast is brought to you by the Sports Info Solutions Data Hub, located at SISDataHub.com. With the SIS Data Hub, our elite team of researchers and video scouts have worked together to create a revolutionary interactive tool. The SIS Data Hub gives you countless layers of customizable filters to account for any factors imaginable. The Data Hub is also the only place to view exclusive proprietary statistics like total points, positive play percentage, and independent quarterback rating. By combining this with the ability for the user to add an unlimited number of filters based on SIS charting data, the Data Hub is a trusted tool for coaches, scouts, and media, and it could be yours too. Right now, you can get a free 1-week trial to this revolutionary database when you go to SISDataHub.com and register for an account. That's SISDataHub.com. Coming right back in, we've got Scott Spratt here with Aaron and I, and Scott was at Sports Info Solutions before I came to the company in 2016. Back in 2015, the partnership between Football Outsiders and Sports Info Solutions came together. Scott, from your perspective, what do you remember about this time?
It was actually really exciting. I mean, I had done so much work on the baseball side for what was then Baseball Info Solutions, but bridging into a new sport, it was just like a really creative time. And, me and guys like Greg Thomas and Dan Forenbach were basically coming up with, how we were going to collect the data, how we were going to organize the data in the database, and all kinds of things like that. And we were really fortunate to have that partnership with Football Outsiders and Aaron so we could get some guidance about how we would do that. But it was just a ton of new ideas, and it was really a lot of fun to build something from the ground that way.
Yeah, and I've been lucky to reap the benefits of it since I came in. Aaron, what was the formation of that partnership like from your end?
Well, it was good for me because I had been spending a lot of time putting together charting data using volunteers, which was very, very difficult. I mean, first of all, for 1 or 2 people to organize all of this data was nearly impossible. Second of all, over the course of the season, we would lose charters, so we would start having games that went uncharted. So we were still charting and finishing games into April, and we couldn't track anywhere near the amount of stuff that SIS is tracking now. So the program for SIS started with the categories that FO was doing and started with our sort of rubric as the starting point, but then has added all kinds of things like the type of zone coverage or the type of drop, like you just mentioned. So, and I think it's also been able to create more consistency between the charters when it comes to marking subjective things like blown blocks and broken tackles.
That's interesting stuff. What were some of the big challenges at that time? I'm wondering, Scott, you mentioned the guys that you were working with at the time, like Greg Thomas, Dan Forenbach, and we're still, Dan's still with the company, of course, and Greg is somebody that I think we're all, like I said, I'm thankful that you were here to set this up. I'm thankful for Greg and what he did setting the foundation here. You mentioned some of the challenges with the size of the data, stuff like that. What else comes to mind about that time that was either a roadblock or something that you remember?
Well, I think the funniest story that I can think of was during our first season doing that data collection was when they took away the game book files that we used to use for the play-by-play. It's like, I think this was like week 8 or week 9 or something, and they were just no longer available to the public. So we were all just sort of scrambling to even put together the basic charting data at that point. And fortunately, having guys like Greg and having Ben Jedlovic there, we were able to sort of scramble to put that stuff together based on the collection that we were doing. But that was just kind of a rude awakening, I guess, early on in the process. I mean, that would have been a problem.
Worst week in Football Outsiders history. The week that the NFL, without telling anybody, got rid of XML code for game books.
That's rough. I mean, I feel like there are a lot of weeks where Game Pass will have its malfunctions and different games, and you'll be blanked out for certain plays. But I know how much we can rely on certain things like that to audit and check the data and make sure that kind of you got the skeleton for things right. And I can only imagine what kind of a nightmare that was.
Yeah, it was the week of the election, so at least it gave us something else to think about while we were panicking over the lack of game books.
So everybody around the country is complaining about one thing or another, and you guys are just XML.
Where are our game books?
Yeah, so that was a good one. And then I would say the other big challenge that stood out to me was just trying to figure out exactly where we wanted to go with the business. A lot of what Baseball Info Solutions has been doing was, things like, again, quality assurance, doing great business-to-business work for MLB teams and things along those lines. But I feel like there's just a really big appetite for this type of advanced football work from the public, just football fans in general. And for a long time, Football Outsiders has been kind of one of the only places where people could get it. And so we were debating like what we wanted to do from like a business to consumer perspective. And, I think that's how the podcast got started. But, I just felt like we had a lot of ideas and a lot of interests, but we had to sort of figure out where we wanted to go with everything.
And that's kind of where I wanted to go next was to talk about the podcast and kind of how that idea cropped up. It sounds like it was because of that B2C kind of shift in the way people were consuming football analytics. But I mean, obviously, and this is something that I've definitely been working through since I've been here, the NFL is just not where baseball is in terms of this stuff. It's starting to move and it's starting to come along. But I mean, it's been a long time coming. Aaron, you started Football Outsiders in what, 2003?
Yeah, 2003. This is my 16th year of doing it, which is kind of crazy. I still think of it a little bit as my goofy little hobby. It's kind of strange now that there are all these other companies involved in my goofy little hobby. It seems like it's less of my goofy little hobby now.
Yeah, it's your goofy little corner of the universe. And it's pretty cool that it's all just grown into this. So who was it? Scott, was it you guys approaching Aaron, or Aaron, did you approach the BIS guys, as it were, about starting off the charts?
No, it was definitely the SIS guys. I think it was Ben Jedlovic's idea to do a podcast.
It was. We were sort of trying to figure out both, since SIS is going to be taking over the charting for Football Outsiders, like what would that mean and the give and takes and all of that. And I think just trying to figure out how we could kind of learn each other's businesses and get to a place where we were more collaborative. And it was like a really good tool for that. Actually, hilariously, Aaron probably deleted this email immediately, but the first show that we were doing, I sent Aaron this exhaustive list of things that I thought would be fun to talk about on the podcast. And it was all these like esoteric ideas about like, how do these things relate? Let's do correlation studies, blah, blah, blah. And Aaron was like, buddy, we have a billion things to do. We can't talk about all this nonsense. But I think we kind of quickly hit our stride anyway, and it kind of worked from the beginning.
I still think of things a little bit coming from the radio perspective of like, don't get too into the weeds. I mean, I realize our podcast is pretty in the weeds as far as podcasts go, but
hopefully it's a balanced thing for the guys that like to listen to it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I think we definitely think about that sometimes. We try to explain things so that we're not leaving anybody out in the cold. But I mean, in 2019, there's something to be said. The world of podcasts is because there are all these super niche people out there that really want to get this sort of conversation where you have guys that have been doing sports analytics for 20 years or have worked in the league and everything else. I think, to some extent, I think that I wonder that in trying to make things more accessible, sometimes we do a disservice in not getting into the real nitty gritty that maybe some of our listeners would enjoy. So I don't know. I always think there's something on both sides of it. And I think we find a pretty good balance.
And that's always really been the ultimate challenge of companies like Sports Info Solutions and Football Outsiders, because we're often trying to educate people. And this actually originally was teams that were kind of breaking into analytics for the first time. You have to communicate to them and to everybody in terms that are easy to understand so you can make good decisions and think about things in like these more sophisticated ways. And it's really fun. And that's why I think it's growing so rapidly now in football too, not just in baseball.
Yeah, well, from Bill James in baseball to Aaron in football, to people
John Hollinger,
yeah, anybody you want. All of these people, what they have in common is I think they're very readable. that they're very interesting people that have interesting opinions. If they weren't writing about whatever sport it was, they'd be making interesting charts and graphs about something else that the rest of the world doesn't.
Someday I'll post for everybody my articles from the Boston Phoenix about like Manny Ramirez's hair and the Rawhide Kid.
I want all of your like music reviews. I just there's such.
I've got a whole file of my best music reviews. I should post that online. That'd be good.
There's such a knowledge in there that I don't think people really realize just how deep in that game you were.
Oh yeah, I mean, God, I still have great memories of the radio business and of like when I was music director at WKRO and something would come in that you could just knew it was a hit. And I would walk through the office with the boombox playing it for people being like, this is the next number one song. Here it is. This is the next number one song. So,
was it the boombox on the shoulder? Like,
no, they were smaller boomboxes in the 90s.
Okay.
I'm like Radio, not Radio Raheem here.
That's what I'm picturing. Like, all right, that's awesome. Now, Scott, obviously we've seen some of these articles. What else can we expect to see you working on this year at Football Outsiders?
Well, I mean, I've only been on board for a couple of weeks, so a lot of this is still in the planning stages. But I know I'm going to be writing a column early in the weeks during the football season, looking back at the most compelling fourth quarters and on what plays were the big swingers that made the biggest differences in the eventual outcome of the game. And then I think I'm going to be driving a lot of the expansion Football Outsiders is going to be doing onto the fantasy side of things, potentially with both articles and podcasts. Maybe Aaron will have some additional thoughts there.
Yeah, we're looking into the possibility of doing something fantasy related for like a Football Outsiders fantasy podcast. And I believe we're going to start a weekly sit-start type column from Scott with fantasy analysis. So we've always people wanted more fantasy analysis from us, and I think we're going to go in that direction.
Well, I know Corey March here at SIS has always been interesting in getting more of a fantasy podcast going. So maybe you'll have to have him on as a guest. I know he's always itching to talk about that stuff in a way that, frankly, I'm not. All right. And then, Scott, you're a Panthers guy from the Carolinas. What can we expect to see from your Panthers this year?
Well, I do think the defense might be better this year than it's been since, say, the Super Bowl season. You know, they really added some help on the pass rusher side with signing Gerald McCoy and Bruce Irvin, bringing in rookie Brian Burns. And I feel like defensively they're just going to be really strong, but it's all really going to hinge on how Cam Newton's shoulder turns out after the offseason surgery. You know, last year when he really couldn't throw the ball down the field in the second half, that's really when they stopped winning games. And I think he's going to have to be healthy because the offense is just – it's built to work around him, even though they're guys with like McCaffrey with speed now to sort of get the ball out of his hands quickly. It's going to rely on Cam.
I'll tell you what, we were talking at the beginning of the podcast about Melvin Gordon and the question of running back replaceability. And I was playing with the running back comments and projections for the Football Outsiders Almanac right before we came on to do the podcast. And I got to tell you, Carolina would be an amazing test of running back replaceability because they've got, after Christian McCaffrey, there's Cameron Artis-Payne gets like 12 carries a year. I keep over-projecting him every year just because you have to project a backup running back to get carries. Somebody's got to. And then they've got Jordan Scarlett, who is like a 5th or 6th round pick. I mean, if McCaffrey is injured, you think they're screwed. And then you think, well, running backs aren't that important. And then you think, oh, well, but McCaffrey is more important as a receiver. So that would be a really interesting test case. I know it's not a test case you want to see.
No, I definitely do not want to see that at all.
But it would definitely be a really interesting test case. I also think one of the interesting debates I've seen a lot in the fantasy community is DJ Moore versus Curtis Samuel. I've got DJ Moore projected, as the clear number one, but there are a lot of people who are really high on Samuel, despite the fact that he still hasn't really produced too much in his first 2 years in the league.
Yeah, I feel like Samuel really wows you with the tools. He's just incredibly fast, and so it's easy to get excited about him. But for me, I'm a big DJ Moore fan. It's a lot of what he does is a little bit more difficult to see, but he's just so dangerous after the catch, kind of like in a Golden Tate kind of way where he's just kind of physical and powering his way through, even though he's not like an overwhelmingly big kind of player. I really could see him breaking out this season. I'm very excited about him.
On that thought, Scott, we saw the Panthers a while ago take the approach of really trying to build with these big receivers, with maybe the thought being there that they fit with Cam, maybe being a little bit of a less accurate guy, and kind of having those big body guys being something that he could work with. Are they kind of moving in a different direction now, would you say? And would you say, with guys like McCaffrey performing so well, would you say that it seems to be a good strategy? Where do you fall on that?
Yeah, Cam's particular miss when he throws the ball is high. So it was kind of nice to have guys like Kelvin Benjamin who could really get up there and catch the ball. But the problem was those guys just weren't fast enough or quick enough to separate and get open. And I think that led to Cam holding onto the ball more, and it led to him getting hit more. And I think they decided that it was more important for Cam to get rid of the ball quickly and try to avoid hits to extend the length of his career. And that's why they've added so much quickness and speed with the McCaffreys and Samuels of the world. I think it will be effective, but it's hard to know so far because Cam couldn't make it healthy through last season. I don't think that was the reason, but he did perform much better last year and was more accurate, even adjusting for the depth of pass last year.
Oh, the first half of the year, he was probably at his best as a passer, even better than he was in 2015. But yeah, then he just collapsed after the shoulder injury.
Well, hopefully he can have a rebound like we saw with Andrew Luck. I think there's some reason to believe that could be what's in store for him. I think like you're saying, I think they figured out a little bit with him what's going on there. Flipping it around on the defense, Luke Keuchly. How good is Luke Keuchly, Scott?
Aaron's probably the one that can pull out the numbers to tell you exactly how good he is. But my perspective is he's been the best middle linebacker in the league for the past 5 or 6 years or however long it's been. And he's incredibly good. He's just so shockingly fast and makes great reads, great cuts. He really has the total package. He's even pretty good in coverage. It's just a question of, again, health. Like a guy that suffered a lot of concussions already in his career. I just really hope he can avoid them going forward so he can play into his 30s.
The Seattle fans will have a Bobby Wagner argument for you. But
that's
I
fair,
think
too.
For the last really 5 or 6 years, I think it's been Keuchly. Last year, it may have been Wagner. But for the last 5 or 6 years, it's been Keuchly.
I think you could get most people to sign up to agree with that one. I think there's a case to be made that he might be as important to their defense as Cam Newton is to their offense, which is saying a lot, I think, as we would all agree.
But now you have no Thomas Davis, right? It was the double. Look, I mean, we all know edge rushers and coverage guys are more important than off-ball linebackers, but they had the best pair of off-ball linebackers in the league, and now they don't. I mean, Shaq Thompson's a good player, but he's not what Thomas Davis was.
No arguments there for me, Scott.
No, I'm gonna miss having Thomas Davis around. He was a real fan favorite, and he's still on some of the local Charlotte commercials, which is fun.
That's good to hear. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much, Scott. Thanks for coming on. As always, to our audience, please help spread the word about Off the Charts by recommending us to your football-loving friends. Always helpful if you subscribe, rate, and review, and we will have the award-winning Scott Spratt on more often throughout the season. As always, you can find us on Twitter at sportsinfo_SIS. I'm at Matt Mano, MATTMANO. Aaron at FO_A Shots. And you can find Scott at Scott_Spratt, SPRATT. For Aaron Schatz, I'm Matt Manocherian, and thank you for joining us for the latest episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast.